If you want to understand what her distance really means, stay with me till the end. Distance is emotional exhaustion, not drama. It is not a sudden emotional outburst or a manipulative tactic designed to gain attention. It is the quiet result of carrying too much for too long without feeling met halfway. Emotional exhaustion builds slowly, often invisibly, through repeated moments where effort is given but not reciprocated, where feelings are expressed but not truly heard, and where needs are minimized or postponed in the name of patience. What looks like coldness on the surface is usually the aftermath of warmth that was never fully received. By the time distance appears, the emotional energy required to explain, negotiate, or hope has already been depleted. Emotional exhaustion develops when someone repeatedly chooses understanding over being understood. It shows up when a woman constantly adjusts her expectations, lowers her standards, or silences her discomfort to keep harmony alive. Each compromise feels small in isolation, but together they create a heavy emotional weight. Over time, the nervous system learns that expressing feelings leads to disappointment rather than relief. Distance then becomes a form of rest. It is the mind and heart stepping back to recover from the strain of always trying to connect while feeling alone in that effort. What is often mislabeled as drama is actually the absence of emotional capacity. Drama is loud, reactive, and expressive. Exhaustion is quiet, withdrawn, and controlled. When someone is emotionally exhausted, they no longer have the energy to argue, clarify, or seek reassurance. They stop repeating themselves because repetition has taught them that being understood is unlikely. Silence replaces explanation not as a punishment, but as self-preservation. Distance becomes the safest way to exist without further emotional depletion. Emotional exhaustion also forms when accountability is missing. When concerns are brushed aside, when apologies are spoken without change, or when patterns repeat despite conversations, the emotional system learns that effort does not lead to resolution. This creates a deep sense of futility. At that point, stepping back feels more rational than continuing to invest. Distance is not meant to provoke guilt or fear. It is meant to reduce emotional exposure. It is the boundary created when verbal boundaries were ignored or misunderstood. Another critical aspect of emotional exhaustion is the loss of emotional safety. Emotional safety comes from consistency, responsiveness, and reliability. When those elements are unstable or absent, the body remains in a state of emotional alertness. Over time, that alertness becomes fatigue. Distance then functions as a way to calm the internal chaos. It allows space to think clearly, feel less reactive, and regain emotional balance. The withdrawal is not impulsive. It is measured, controlled, and often deeply considered. Distance driven by exhaustion is also a sign of internal clarity forming. The individual begins to recognize patterns, assess emotional costs, and question whether continued effort is sustainable. This process does not happen overnight. It unfolds gradually as emotional reserves diminish. When distance finally appears, it is not confusion, it is certainty taking shape. The silence, the reduced engagement, and the emotional withdrawal reflect a decision to stop overextending where emotional nourishment is absent. In this state, emotional expression feels like labor rather than connection. Even small interactions feel heavy because they carry unresolved history. Distance becomes the only way to interrupt that cycle. It is not an attempt to control the other person's behavior, but a way to regain control over one's own emotional well-being. Exhaustion teaches that peace is sometimes found not by fixing the situation, but by stepping away from what continually drains emotional energy. Silence is a response, not a strategy. It is not calculated, rehearsed, or designed to manipulate an outcome. Silence emerges when words lose their power and emotional expression no longer feels safe or effective. It often follows repeated attempts to communicate, explain, and be understood. When those attempts are met with dismissal, defensiveness, or temporary acknowledgement without lasting change, the emotional system begins to shut down. Silence becomes the natural response to the realization that speaking no longer leads to connection, clarity, or resolution. Silence is what happens when communication has been overused without being valued. Each conversation that goes unheard leaves behind a small residue of disappointment. Over time, that residue accumulates into emotional fatigue. At that point, silence is not avoidance, it is resignation. It reflects an internal conclusion that continuing to talk will only deepen frustration rather than solve anything. This kind of silence carries the weight of every unacknowledged feeling and every conversation that ended without understanding. Unlike strategic silence, which aims to provoke a reaction, responsive silence is inward-facing. It is about protecting emotional energy, not controlling someone else's behavior. The person withdrawing is no longer trying to influence outcomes or change dynamics. They are responding to an internal boundary being crossed too many times. Silence marks the moment when emotional self-preservation becomes more important than being heard. It is a shift from external engagement to internal regulation. Silence also signals a loss of emotional safety. When expressing vulnerability repeatedly results in invalidation, minimization, or conflict, the nervous system learns that openness leads to discomfort rather than relief. Silence then becomes the safest option available. It allows distance from emotional triggers and reduces the risk of further disappointment. In this way, silence is less about absence and more about containment. It contains emotions that no longer feel welcome or protected in conversation. Another aspect of silence as a response is clarity. Silence often arrives after understanding has already been reached internally. The individual has processed the situation, recognized patterns, and accepted certain truths. There is nothing left to ask, argue, or negotiate. Silence reflects this internal resolution. It is not confusion or indecision. It is acceptance. The lack of words mirrors the absence of further emotional questions. Silence also changes the dynamic of responsibility. When communication stops, it is often because responsibility for emotional labor has been carried unevenly. One person has done the explaining, the adjusting, and the emotional bridging. Silence signals the end of that imbalance. It removes the expectation that one side must continue to translate feelings into words while the other remains unchanged. In that sense, silence restores equilibrium by withdrawing effort where it has not been matched. Silence can be deeply misunderstood because it lacks visible emotion. It does not cry, accuse, or demand, yet it is filled with meaning. It represents emotional boundaries being enforced without confrontation. The absence of words speaks to the exhaustion behind them. Silence communicates that the person has reached a limit where self-respect requires restraint rather than expression. When silence appears, it often follows a long period of trying. It is not the beginning of distance, but the confirmation of it. The person has already emotionally stepped back and is now aligning their behavior with their internal state. Silence reflects alignment between feeling and action. It is the body and mind agreeing that continued communication would only repeat a cycle that has already proven ineffective. Women detach emotionally before they detach physically. The process rarely begins with distance in presence, but with distance in feeling. Long before behavior changes become visible, there is a quiet internal shift taking place. Emotional detachment starts when expectations repeatedly go unmet, and emotional needs are acknowledged but not addressed. It begins in moments where effort is given without return, where emotional availability feels one-sided, and where understanding is promised but not practiced. This internal withdrawal happens gradually, often unnoticed by the other person, because it does not announce itself through conflict or confrontation. Emotional detachment forms through patterns rather than single events. It develops when conversations lead to temporary reassurance instead of lasting change. Each time emotional needs are expressed and met with defensiveness, avoidance, or inconsistency, trust erodes slightly. Over time, the emotional bond weakens not because love disappears, but because emotional safety does. The mind begins to protect itself by lowering emotional investment. Care becomes cautious, hope becomes reserved, and vulnerability becomes selective. This shift is subtle, internal, and deeply personal. As emotional detachment grows, behavior often remains unchanged for a while. Presence is maintained, routines continue, and outward commitment may still exist. This is why emotional withdrawal is often misunderstood or missed entirely. The emotional disconnect is invisible because it lives in reduced expectation rather than reduced interaction. The woman may still show up physically, but emotionally she is already stepping back, no longer placing her emotional well-being in the hands of the relationship. Emotional detachment is also a form of self-regulation. When emotional investment repeatedly leads to disappointment, the nervous system adapts by minimizing exposure. This adaptation is not punishment or manipulation, it is survival. The heart learns to hold back as a way to avoid further emotional strain. At this stage, emotional responses become muted. Reactions soften, enthusiasm fades, and emotional expression becomes measured. The bond loosens internally long before any external separation occurs. Once emotional detachment sets in, physical detachment becomes a matter of alignment rather than decision. The internal separation has already happened. Physical distance simply reflects an emotional truth that has been forming over time. By the time physical detachment occurs, the emotional connection has already been processed, understood, and released internally. This is why physical separation can appear sudden, while the emotional departure was long in the making. Emotional detachment also brings clarity. As emotional investment decreases, perspective increases. The individual begins to see the relationship without emotional distortion. Patterns become clearer, red flags more visible, and compromises more conscious. Emotional detachment allows for honest assessment without the influence of attachment-driven hope. This clarity often leads to acceptance rather than conflict, making the eventual physical detachment calmer and more controlled. Another key aspect of emotional detachment is the shift in emotional responsibility. The woman stops trying to fix, guide, or emotionally carry the relationship. She releases the role of emotional manager and allows space for reality to reveal itself. This withdrawal of emotional labor marks a turning point. When emotional effort is no longer offered freely, the relationship dynamic changes fundamentally. Physical detachment is often the final step, not the first. It occurs when emotional detachment has stabilized and the individual feels grounded enough to act on it. The body follows where the emotions have already gone. What appears to be sudden distance is actually the visible outcome of an invisible emotional process that unfolded slowly, quietly, and with intention. Chasing weakens attraction because attraction thrives on balance, not pursuit driven by fear of loss. When one person begins to chase, the dynamic subtly shifts from mutual interest to emotional imbalance. What was once a shared connection becomes a one-sided effort, and that imbalance is felt on an instinctive level. Attraction is rooted in choice, not pressure. The moment attention turns into insistence, curiosity turns into resistance. What was naturally engaging begins to feel emotionally heavy. Chasing often communicates insecurity rather than affection. Repeated messages, constant explanations, and urgent attempts to fix things send an unspoken signal that emotional stability depends on the other person's response. This creates pressure, not closeness. Attraction requires emotional autonomy, the sense that both individuals are choosing each other freely. When chasing begins, that freedom diminishes. The pursued individual may feel overwhelmed, obligated, or emotionally cornered, even if they once cared deeply. Another reason chasing weakens attraction is that it disrupts polarity. Emotional polarity exists when both individuals maintain their sense of self while engaging with each other. Chasing collapses that polarity by placing one person in a position of emotional dependence. The dynamic shifts from desire to reassurance seeking. Instead of curiosity and mutual pull, the interaction becomes centered around soothing anxiety. Attraction fades when emotional intensity replaces emotional stability. Chasing also removes the space necessary for reflection. Distance, when allowed naturally, gives room for emotional processing. It allows both individuals to feel absence, evaluate connection, and recognize value. Chasing fills that space with noise. It prevents emotional clarity and replaces it with urgency. When someone is constantly present, there is no opportunity to miss them, no silence in which appreciation can form. Attraction needs space to breathe. In many cases, chasing reinforces the very behavior it aims to change. When distance is met with pursuit, it teaches the other person that withdrawal will be followed by increased effort. This dynamic subtly rewards disengagement and deepens the imbalance. Over time, the chaser becomes the one carrying the emotional weight of the relationship, while the other becomes increasingly passive. Attraction cannot survive where effort is uneven. Chasing also blurs emotional boundaries. Healthy attraction depends on respect for emotional limits, both one's own and the other's. When someone chases, they often ignore their own discomfort in an attempt to restore connection. This self-neglect is felt on an emotional level. People are drawn to those who respect themselves, not those who abandon their own needs to maintain proximity. Attraction weakens when self-respect is compromised. Another overlooked aspect is how chasing shifts focus away from growth. Instead of reflecting, improving, or recalibrating emotionally, energy is poured into pursuit. This stalls personal development and reinforces attachment to an outcome rather than alignment with values. Attraction grows when someone is grounded, self-aware, and evolving. Chasing locks attention on the other person's reactions rather than one's own emotional center. Chasing transforms connection into negotiation. Instead of two people choosing each other, one person is attempting to convince the other. Desire cannot be negotiated into existence. The more one tries to secure it through effort alone, the more elusive it becomes. Attraction responds to presence, confidence, and emotional independence, not to persistence fueled by fear. Self-reflection is more powerful than explanation because growth does not come from convincing others. It comes from understanding oneself. Explanations are outward-facing. They attempt to shape perception, justify behavior, or repair an image. Self-reflection, on the other hand, is inward-facing. It examines patterns, motivations, and emotional responses without the need for validation. When someone chooses reflection over explanation, they move from reaction to awareness, and awareness is what creates lasting change. Explanations often arise from discomfort. When conflict or distance appears, the instinct is to clarify, defend, or correct misunderstandings. While communication is important, excessive explanation can become a way to avoid accountability. It focuses on being understood rather than understanding what needs to change. Self-reflection interrupts that pattern by asking deeper questions. It shifts the focus from how do I explain myself better to what in my behavior or emotional responses contributed to this outcome. That shift transforms confusion into insight. Self-reflection also reveals recurring patterns that explanations tend to hide. When someone repeatedly finds themselves in similar situations, similar conflicts, or similar emotional outcomes, explanation alone cannot resolve the issue. Reflection allows those patterns to surface. It brings awareness to emotional triggers, attachment styles, and unmet needs. This awareness is uncomfortable because it requires honesty, but it is also empowering. It places responsibility back in the hands of the individual rather than in external circumstances. Another reason self-reflection holds more power is that it restores emotional agency. Explanations often seek approval or forgiveness from others. They depend on external acceptance to feel complete. Self-reflection removes that dependency. It allows someone to recognize their own missteps, boundaries, and emotional limits without needing immediate validation. This internal clarity creates emotional stability. When a person understands themselves, they no longer need to over-explain their intentions or defend their actions. Self-reflection also leads to behavioral change, not just emotional relief. Explanations may temporarily ease tension, but they rarely alter underlying behavior. Reflection, when done honestly, exposes the gap between intention and impact. It highlights where words and actions were misaligned. This awareness naturally influences future choices. Change that comes from reflection is organic and sustainable because it is driven by understanding rather than fear of losing someone. In emotionally complex situations, explanations can even escalate conflict. When one person explains while the other feels unheard, the dynamic becomes adversarial. Reflection softens this dynamic by creating space for empathy. By understanding one's own emotional processes, it becomes easier to recognize and respect those of others. This does not require lengthy justification. Presence, consistency, and adjusted behavior communicate far more than words ever could. Self-reflection also strengthens self-respect. When someone is willing to examine themselves honestly, they demonstrate emotional maturity. They no longer need to prove their worth through explanation. They allow their actions, growth, and emotional regulation to speak for them. This quiet confidence is often more convincing than any argument. Explanations try to preserve connection through words. Self-reflection rebuilds connection through alignment. When someone changes from the inside, the external dynamic naturally shifts. Relationships respond to energy, consistency, and self-awareness more than to perfectly crafted explanations. Not every distance means the end, but every distance demands awareness. Distance is often misunderstood as a final verdict, a sign that something is broken beyond repair. In reality, distance can serve many purposes. It can be a pause, a recalibration, or a moment of emotional self-assessment. What gives distance its meaning is not the space itself, but how that space is recognized and responded to. Without awareness, distance grows into disconnection. With awareness, it can become a turning point. Distance frequently emerges when emotional needs are no longer aligned. One person may need reassurance, while the other needs space. One may seek closeness, while the other seeks clarity. This mismatch does not automatically signal the end of a connection, but it does signal the need for attention. Awareness begins with noticing the shift without reacting defensively. It requires observing changes in communication, emotional tone, and energy without immediately assigning blame or jumping to conclusions. Awareness also involves understanding that distance is often a message rather than an action. It communicates discomfort, overwhelm, or unmet needs that may not have been expressed verbally. When distance appears, it invites reflection rather than reaction. Instead of rushing to fill the gap with explanations or demands, awareness asks what conditions created the gap in the first place. It looks beneath the surface behavior to the emotional context driving it. Another aspect of awareness is recognizing personal patterns. Distance can trigger fear, insecurity, or urgency, especially for those who associate closeness with safety. Without awareness, these triggers lead to chasing, over-explaining, or emotional withdrawal. With awareness, those impulses are observed rather than acted upon. This creates emotional regulation, which stabilizes the dynamic instead of intensifying it. Awareness allows space to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. Distance also tests emotional maturity. It reveals how comfortable someone is with uncertainty and emotional discomfort. Awareness during distance means tolerating silence without assigning catastrophic meaning to it. It means holding one's sense of self steady even when external reassurance is reduced. This emotional steadiness is often what prevents temporary distance from turning into permanent separation.